So hi everyone, my name is Xiaokang Xue, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this panel discussion on environmental sustainability, climate change, and energy. So in recent years, there has been a growing awareness of the urgent need to address climate change, and we have seen an increasing number of initiatives aiming to promoting sustainability from the energy industry. So this panel will bring together a diverse group of experts who will share their insights and perspectives on the energy industry and something we need for the energy transition. So we are fortunate to have Professor Alice Pan with us today as a moderator. Professor Pan is a highly respected expert in the field of climate change with extensive experiences in climate change and climate solutions. She'll be facilitating and guiding us through a thoughtful conversation. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pan. Yeah, so I'm confident that this panel will be an informative and engaging discussion, and I look forward to hearing the exchange of ideas from our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. So let's get started. Thanks.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks for inviting all of us here today. Just checking, can you all hear me correctly? Yeah, can you hear me in the room?
Yes. Yes, we can hear in the room.
Okay, wonderful. So hi, hello everyone, and welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. Thank you for being with us today for this 2023 Brown China Summit symposium where academics, investors, politicians, economists, and students meet and discuss insights into US-China relations and opportunities. So my name is Alice Plain. I'm a senior fellow at the Watson Institute here at Brown. And I will be moderating our wonderful panel discussion today on accelerating the adoption of renewable energy globally and in China, challenges and opportunities. Our panel will last about 70 minutes, starting now and ending at 11:30. We will try to keep about 15-20 minutes in the end for questions from the room. I understand we will not be able to take questions from the chat or Q&A, but you can try and we'll see if we can manage to moderate them as well. As people are joining us here, I would like to introduce our four guest speakers for today, starting with Dr. Philip Andrew Speed. Dr. Andrew Speed has spent the first 20 years of his career as a geologist, including working on oil exploration for British Petroleum in China. He retrained in energy policy and will bring to the discussion his kind of double hat as an expert practitioner as well as an academic on energy issues, specifically in China. Welcome, Philip. We also have here with us Professor Cary Krosinsky. I think he's speaking from Providence, Rhode Island in the US. He's also teaching at Brown as well as Yale and NYU. He is the co-founder of the Sustainable Finance Institute, and he is also the co-founder and director of the Carbon Tracker Initiative, which I use in my classes. He published 7 books revolving around the importance of addressing the dual challenge of economic and environmental sustainability. Third with us today is Mr. Kevin Tu, speaking with us from Beijing, China. He is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Kevin Tu is also the managing director of Agora Energy Transition China, where he recently published an overview of China's energy transition. Before that, Kevin Tu, amongst various other positions, has spent 10 years at the International Energy Agency in Paris. He's also been the director of China Energy and Climate Program at the Carnegie Endowment. part of his career also included being a construction project manager for Sinopec, a Chinese national oil company. Last but not least, Dr. Angel Su, assistant, is speaking to us from North Carolina in the US. Angel Su is an assistant professor of public policy and the environment at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's the founder of EnviroLab, using quantitative and interdisciplinary approaches to environmental issues. Among many other publications, Dr. Su has contributed to the report on greenhouse gas emissions information for the US National Academy of Science. She also contributed to the United Nations Environmental Program Emissions Gap Report, which I also use in my classes, and she was the lead author for the chapter on non-state actors. Last but not least, she's a contributing author to the IPCC's 6th Assessment Review. And as I'm sure all of you know in the room, the synthesis report for this assessment review is about to be published officially tomorrow. You can already read it on the IPCC's website. It's a phenomenal read. So congratulations for your contribution to this, Dr. Su. Before I let our esteemed guest speakers share with us their insights, I would like to present a few facts and figures to inform our discussion. I hope it can serve as a guide to our collective understanding as to why the energy transition, both in China and globally, is so crucial. So first, I would like to remind everyone that although the historic responsibility of the current amount of greenhouse gases into our common atmosphere is overwhelmingly the responsibility of the EU and the US, China has now become by far the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, accounting for 1/3 of global annual emissions. Yet, if you divide those emissions by the amount of people in each country, you will find what we call the emissions per capita, meaning that you can compare the average emissions per person in each and every country. The average American emits close to 15 tons of carbon equivalent per year. An average Russian emits 12 tons. An average Chinese, 8 tons, pretty much the same as an average European, around 7 tons. Well, in order to avert the worst consequences of climate change, we would need to emit an average of 2 tons per person. In other terms, we are collectively failing, and the consequences are and will be dire if we do not succeed into this energy transition. Also, I'd like to note that I've been listening into the other panels from yesterday on the US-China dialogue, and all of our guest speakers in the previous panels have noted how the discussion and the dialogue between the US and China was broken on so many essential geopolitical, economic, and trade issues. I would like to note that climate change is one of the very few issues where the dialogue is actually ongoing, thanks to John Cary in the US and Xie Hua in China. Last point I wanted to make before leaving our guest speakers take the stage. About China. China is the first producer of renewable energy today, with 700 terawatts of renewable energy produced, still increasing steadfast. Yet, this is barely a fraction of the 42,000 terawatts of energy consumed in China every year. So currently, renewable energy, although a thriving field, is still largely outweighed by fossil fuels and especially coal. So my first question today to our esteemed experts is going to be the same question for our 4 experts. And I'm hoping that each and every one of them can bring their respective perspectives on this. The first question for all of you is, how do you understand the stakes the energy transition for China and or for the rest of the world? What are the emerging technological, financing, or policy threats and opportunities that you see for this energy transition? Dr. Andrew Speed, if you'd like to start with taking this question, there will be about 3 to 4 minutes per speaker. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Alice. I think anybody watching China from the outside over the last 3 or 4 years will have seen two apparent policy contradictions. On the one hand, there's a tension between coal production and clean energy installation, which Alice has just mentioned. And secondly, there's tension between the state and the market. So, we look at all the announcements on coal consumption and production is rising, though last year consumption of coal may have been flat. Investment in new coal mines and in new thermal power stations, particularly coal-fired power stations, is increasing, though of course they are using ultra supercritical technology. They're continuing to build capacity for turning coal into chemicals, and the development of carbon capture is very slow. So that's the sort of the bad news. The good news, as mentioned, is that the investment in solar and wind grows, 120 gigawatts last year. And so wind and solar account for about 14% of power generation last year, up from 6.5% in 2017. And they're going to build another 165 gigawatts of new wind and solar this year. So you got one against the other, and the March 2023 work report said, give full play to the role of coal as the main energy source. On the other hand, the NDRC talked a lot about peaking carbon emissions and carbon neutrality and reducing energy intensity. So in simple terms, not dissimilar from some other countries, short-term focus on energy security, but still the long-term vision on carbon emissions reduction. But it's certainly confusing looking inwards from the outside. State versus the market. I mean, for years they've been talking about market reform. When Xi Jinping came in 10 years ago, he said, let markets work, let prices be determined by the markets. Power sector reform goes back to about 1998 and has been stalled for a while. It's picked up. But despite the recent reforms, 80% of power is traded on medium and long-term contracts, not on spot markets. So it means that renewable energy is not getting in there as it would be in a real spot market. The national carbon market was announced in 2021 and or started in 2021. It's operating as a functioning exchange, but it isn't doing much for reducing emissions because there's been over allocation, free allocation. Allocation is based on intensity and fraudulent reporting and all sorts of problems. And in the meanwhile, the role of the state has been tightened under Xi Jinping. And if you again look at the March 2023 report, there's a wonderful phrase here: enable the market to play a decisive role in resource allocation. Next sentence: give full play to the role of government and promote a better combination of effective market and effective government. I leave the other scholars to tell me later what this means. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Andrew Speed. I would like to give the floor now to Professor Cary Krosinsky.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll be brief, and I'm looking forward to everyone else's responses as well. Bloomberg New Energy Finance does probably the best job of tracking trends from an energy and investment perspective. From their statistics, China is by far the largest investor in the low carbon transition. It's not even close, considering that China is the world's second largest economy. We here in the US obviously aren't doing nearly enough if China is way ahead of us in that regard. The other thing Bloomberg New Energy Finance has done is report on the trillions of dollars gap. There's a trillions of dollars gap when it comes to how much we need to actually invest to make these transitions happen. And they need to happen globally. So I'm much more focused on what do we actually need to do differently to make that happen. In that regard, I teach a class at Brown every fall on sustainable finance. We actually worked with 12 Brown students on our 7th book, which was called Modern China. And the whole idea there was to try to help. We've largely failed, I'm afraid, to help bridge the gap of misunderstandings between the U.S. and China, which was very much a major focus and not occurring in a successful way. This is tied closely to John Cary, who spoke to our Yale Energy Studies seminar about 4 years ago, prior to his role as climate envoy, and he was quite adamant that he was very upset actually that the previous administration had broken the relationship that he had built leading up to the Paris Agreement, and he was very keen that the U.S. and China should work together to invest in the developing world to help them scale up on renewable energy. And what we really do need, and this is why we work on these things as the Sustainable Finance Institute as well, is a global transition, country by country, and even province by province. In China, the complications are, that to rapidly transform could be economically disruptive. And China obviously is, as the previous comments were correctly providing, trying to juggle the need for a transition, which it's working on as hard as any country, also from an electric vehicle standpoint, but at the same time needing to maintain its financial and economic wherewithal. So province by province, the transition in China will be challenging, there is a lot of work going on in pilot zones, trying to build what might become scalable to make that transition actually happen. So we're primarily focused on how do we actually make this transition happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just a reminder for our audience, the question is, how do you understand the stakes of the energy transition for China and or for the rest of the world? What are the emerging technological, financing and policy threats and opportunities that you see in this energy transition? I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Kevin Tu.
Thank you, Anis. I would like to look at the big picture first, because China is currently at a crossroads in many arenas. Since 1978, economic prosperity in China is largely based on 3 key pillars. First one is a demographic dividend. Since 1980s, a relatively young population structure coupled with a hard-working culture is conducive to economic growth. However, since last year, Chinese population declined for the first time in 6 decades, and aging becomes a new norm in China, and with profound implication for energy transition. The second one is the political willingness to continuously initiate incremental reform to improve status quo. Whenever China's status quo is compared with advanced economy in the past, significant gap often exists. However, average Chinese didn't bother much. The reason is simple. As long as the country was incrementally improving itself, the gap would be eliminated sooner or later. However, in recent years, the public's confidence on incremental improvement has been significantly eroded by the pandemic, among other social, economic, and political shocks. Last but not least, a relatively benign and friendly international environment. Since the outbreak of US-China trade war in 2018, China faces an increasingly less accommodating international environment, exacerbated by the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. In the energy transition arena, I heard lots of contradictions by Philip. Yes, I fully agree. I can even support this with a few numbers. Taking Shanxi as an example, last year, this province produced 1.3 billion tons of coal alone. And last year, China permitted 106 gigawatts of coal-fired power capacity. However, if we look at solar power, wind, battery storage, and electrical vehicle, China ranks the first in the world in terms of both the size of the domestic market and the clean technology manufacturing capacity. So how to reconcile the contradiction between China's short-term energy security anxiety and the country's dual carbon goal will test political wisdom of Chinese decision makers. However, I would also argue China probably will also need a more accommodating international environment to allow the country to focus on domestic challenges, especially climate crisis. When talking about emerging technology opportunity and threats, green hydrogen is certainly a noticeable example. Annual hydrogen production in China stands at around 34 million tons. However, it's dominated by green hydrogen, with coal-based production routes account for around 72%. So that's why China needs to do lots of work to decarbonize its hard-to-abate sector, such as iron and steel, chemical and heavy-duty trucks. Green hydrogen is widely perceived as a non-regret option, but China's infant hydrogen economy need to achieve economy of scale with not only domestic government support, but also international cooperation. For the net part, there's lots of challenges compared with opportunities. I will just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for this overview. Thank you very much. And I will now give the floor to Dr. Angel Su.
Thank you so much, Alice, and thanks so much for the invitation. It's so nice to be on a panel with really old friends. I feel like Kevin and I have known each other for almost 20 years, and Philip and I were just recently in Singapore together, and I've had both of them guest lecture in my China Energy and Environmental Sustainability class. So really happy to be here on this Sunday morning. So I'm really glad, Alice, that you brought up the IPCC and the synthesis report that came out, because as you mentioned, I was lucky enough to contribute to the latest assessment report. And I think that's where I'll start with my comments, is it's really about this bigger global picture of what's really at stake, then talking about the risks that China poses with respect to its energy transition, and then also the opportunity, which Kevin just touched on as well. So in terms of the science, I mean, it's unfortunate because climate change is one of these super wicked problems where we're the ones causing it. At the same time, we're trying to solve it. And unfortunately, it's just getting worse. We only have really 7 years to turn things around dramatically. We have to have global emissions by 2030, so we have any chance of reaching that net zero or our decarbonization goals by 2050. And looking at the Global Carbon Project numbers from last year, it's not looking particularly rosy. After around a 5 to 7% median reduction after the pandemic in global emissions, which was the largest reduction ever achieved in history, we're looking at probably
Angel, I'm afraid we lost the connection with you. Okay, it seems that we've lost a connection with Angel. I'm sorry about that. I hope she can rejoin us soon. So let us continue. Although she was making a very important point on climate science and what it's telling us, as I was saying in my introduction, on how much we're failing right now and how much this energy transition is necessary. Maybe I'll delve into the second round of questions, and hopefully Angel can join us again soon. So maybe Kevin, could you tell us a little more about how you analyze the current state of the US-China relationship on climate and energy matters, and what can we expect from that?
So when we look at this vitally important issue, we could first look at some number. In terms of global share of carbon emissions, China accounts for 31%, United States 14%. So these two countries alone account for near half of global total. So if these two countries couldn't work together, the world will be hopeless to meet the Paris Agreement goal. However, if we look at US stance on climate diplomacy with China, US always insists this should be a separate issue away from all other sticky issues. By comparison, in January 2021, former Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian once mentioned that China-US cooperation in specific areas, i.e. climate change, unlike flowers that can bloom in a greenhouse despite winter chill, is closely linked with bilateral relations as a whole. So there's certainly a contradiction between the stance between these two countries, given the rising geopolitical tensions between these largest two economies and also largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. It's quite difficult for these two countries to work in climate diplomacy in the years to come. Having said that, regarding US-China relations on energy matters before the Russian-Ukraine war, especially during the Donald Trump's presidency, US-China trade war was widely expected to help narrow down bilateral trade deficit. However, after the Russia-Ukrainian war, US LNG and oil exports become attractive alternatives of Russian energy to European countries. So in January 2023, a US House representative even passed a bill to ban release of oil from the US strategic reserve from being exported to China. So the mood has been entirely changed in recent years. So that's why, in theory, US-China should work on energy transition and climate change. But in reality, lots of political wisdom will be needed at both ends to move the agenda forward.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Angel, are you back with us? Okay, apparently she moved out of the room. Okay, Angel, are you back with us?
Yes, I'm so sorry. Of course, as the Murphy's Law would have it, right? Like my internet cut out right as I was giving my intervention. Is it okay for me to pick up where I left off, or should I move on?
Okay. No, please continue on the climate science. And actually, my second question is tied to what you were saying. I also wanted to ask you how you view this renewed dialogue between Cary and Krosinsky on climate matters, and whether you expect a truly ambitious package to be delivered by those two superpowers and super emitters in the next climate conference in Dubai in December. Both in commitments and in delivery of implementation. So please go ahead, and so you have the second question to add on.
Okay, so I think where I left off was talking just about the global stakes and what's really the challenge ahead of us in the world. And so we only have 7 years to have global emissions. Emissions have been increasing. And right now, if we take up all of the national pledges, this is part of the UNEP emissions gap report that you mentioned in the introduction, we are headed towards a 2.8 degree median Celsius
warming world. And that's really far ahead of the 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. So I actually had the good fortune of attending the COP27 climate negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh. It was my 13th in a row. And I think that just the reality of the challenge ahead of us and the fact that we had this great opportunity after COVID. We saw a historic drop in emissions. That was a great reset. I mean, there were leaders meeting in St. Petersburg and at the COP26 in Glasgow that year. There was really, I think, a great, or I think just a lot of excitement around the possibility that we could reset. We could think about green economy, green growth opportunities, and these transitions that the other speakers have mentioned to really help us lock into a decarbonized pathway and turn things around. And unfortunately, it hasn't gone that way, as other speakers, Cary and Philip and Kevin have mentioned, with the oil prices booming and the energy crisis happening due to the Ukraine conflict. And so there's really, I think, just that the challenge has just been almost magnified. And then at the same time, the risks, I think the risks are also compounding as well. We look at what happened in China this past summer with record heat waves, more than 70 days of temperatures that were over 100 degrees, over 40 degrees Celsius. And that affected the country's ability to deliver on hydropower, and that disrupted supply chains, not just within China, but of course globally. I mean, impacts not just were felt in China, but also in Pakistan with record flooding, in the United States, the Pacific Northwest with continued wildfires and droughts and extreme temperatures, and also Europe. It was just, the impacts have been felt, and similarly in China. And I think that's helping to explain a lot of these contradictions that every speaker this morning has brought up. The fact that on one hand, in the work reports and in the top level leadership, you hear an emphasis on China's 2060 carbon neutrality goal and the need to essentially get its power sector to zero carbon by 2050. And just the astronomical numbers and the benchmarks that China needs to hit in terms of nuclear and also in terms of wind and solar increases. So yeah, a 16-fold increase in solar energy, a 9-fold increase in wind power, and increasing nuclear, 16-fold increase in solar, and increasing nuclear by 6 times and doubling hydroelectricity in order to get anywhere close to that particular goal. So I think that helps explain some of the challenges, because climate change is getting worse, the science is getting worse, the impacts are becoming more severe, and it's making it more challenging to really be able to utilize and consume all of this renewable electricity in the way that China really needs. And so, of course, coal is cheap, it's stable baseload power, it's plentiful in China, still more than 60% of their primary energy supply and electricity is still supplied by coal. And so I think that's why we see a lot of these contradictions. And I wrote a New York Times op-ed at the COP26 that talked about this, and how do we reconcile, how do we think about this contradiction of needing China as the country that's responsible for 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions to decarbonize, but then at the same time realizing, as you said, in these per capita terms, be able to lift people, continue to lift people out of poverty, develop the Chinese economy, and at the same time be able to balance this need that the world needs for China to decarbonize. I will add, in terms of the opportunity, what we shared in the IPCC Working Group 3, which was focused on climate change mitigation. That was the working group that I contributed towards. We noted how now these sources of renewable electricity, solar and wind, are cost competitive with fossil fuels. And China is the centerpiece of that story. They single-handedly have brought down global prices for concentrated solar power by 85%, for wind more than 30%. And so it's thanks to China that now the IPCC, what we concluded in that chapter is that it's actually more affordable for countries to build power plants sourced by clean energy sources than to go the route of fossil fuels. So that's a huge conclusion. That's a huge positive story that came out of the IPCC. And I think another piece that Kevin also alluded to is the electrification story, that I think other countries can look to China for a huge opportunity. So I had a friend, Deborah Seligson, who's an assistant professor of political science at Villanova. She was just there recently during the chaotic reopening of China. And she wrote this great piece in, I can't remember the name of the publication, but I'll share it afterwards. But talking about the electrification story of China and the fact that they now have 45 subway lines. 45, which is just incredible, considering they had about half of that just less than a decade ago. And yeah, in terms of their rail system, now it's over 70% electrified. And as of 2021, there are more than 300 million electric two-wheelers on the streets, which is just incredible. And that number continues to grow. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for China as it's undergoing its energy transition and making these huge investments in the clean energy sector to also serve as a model for other countries. And I know I've been talking a lot, but I do want to get to your second question, which is about the opportunity with US cooperation. And I do think it's incredibly important. And as you mentioned, it has been considered traditionally one of these bright spots in otherwise very rocky U.S.-China, the very rocky U.S.-China relationship. And I think that's definitely been the case when there have been challenges on human rights or economic issues or geopolitical military concerns. That's been one area where, because of these longstanding relationships between John Kerry and Xi Jinping, the two sides have been able to come together. But I think now what we're seeing is that that we can't always rely on that. In August, with former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, when I was in COP27 in Egypt, it was, I was speaking with both sides, both the Chinese delegates and also the US delegates. And it was very clear that because of sovereignty concerns, and Xi Jinping just announced them, that they weren't actually having those types of close bilateral conversations that we've come to expect, frankly, out of these annual summits. And so I think that was really challenging until President Joe Biden then at the G20 was able to speak directly with Xi Jinping and restart and reignite those conversations. But this is one of the reasons why, for the US Penn Project on the Future of China Relations, I wrote a white paper that talked about how, while we may not necessarily be able to rely on US-China cooperation very consistently to make progress globally on climate and energy issues. And so we have to think about alternatives. So perhaps it is more about competition, particularly in the clean energy sector. We know that the US and President Biden, through the Inflation Reduction Act, has put as a key piece of that legislation wanting to create incentives for US businesses to grow clean energy technologies and to directly compete with China. And I think that that can help to inspire a race to the top, where we see both countries wanting to be those green technology providers, particularly for countries that are also considering their clean energy transitions. And then also, I think another key piece where we saw, even during the Trump administration, very little cooperation between the two sides was at the subnational and the person-to-person exchange level and private sector. And so in that piece, we also talk a lot about how there was the state of California and former Governor Jerry Brown, who was continuing dialogue with Chinese counterparts in the absence of national leadership. And so we have to look towards other avenues of continued exchange and dialogue on the US-China relationship, because we can't always expect. And so I'm not that hopeful in Dubai that we're going to see a lot of banner announcements from the two sides, and nor should we expect to. I think that US-China, they need to be there. It's important for international trust, but we know that there are other pieces that are still going, and also the competitive piece that will hopefully help us get there faster, because these dialogues can be very slow, very protracted, and very uncertain.
Thank you so much, Angel. And I'll bounce on your invitation to consider, rather than political cooperation, the economic competition. And maybe, Cary, if you want to speak to this, you can either one or the other. But I was hoping to invite you to tell us more on what you think of the role of private finance could be in enhancing this transition, keeping in mind that, yes, the renewable energy share is increasing. However, the overall amount of energy consumed in China is also increasing. And therefore, if we're looking at 2030 peak and 2060 net zero in China, we're far from getting there, although we're on track as per Chinese government announcements tell us. But we definitely need more on the private finance sector. Can private finance actually enhance that transition? What can be the role of ESG in this? And can you tell us more? What is ESG, by the way?
Thank you. I really appreciate your questions. They're getting right to the heart of what we need to move forward with and put behind us. So a few comments. There is something of an anti-ESG movement here in the US, which is largely politically motivated. You could also argue that pushback on China from both political parties is politically motivated at this point. Elections here are decided by a fairly narrow slice of the electorate. Most everyone's made up their mind. And so there's some computer algorithm somewhere telling politicians, you got to be tough on China or you're going to lose that vote. It's very disappointing. It's not very mature, but that's kind of where we are. Anyway, we've done a lot of thinking and work on this, and we cover this in our classes. For whatever reason, ESG has become a thing, as if it's a single thing in the discourse, whether it's in the media or even from practitioners. ESG is an acronym. It stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. Those present a very wide variety of specific issues that present possible risks and possible opportunities. So when we were in China for the event hosted in Shenzhen in early 2019, the air was pretty bad for the 10 days we were in the country. You know, the inversion effect was happening, and the air was particularly bad in Beijing. And you know, when you actually taste the air, it's important that more people do, because then you can see why China's been so motivated to change as it rises up economically. So what does it take to actually motivate change is a big question. Will the U.S. be a constructive partner in that going forward is a question, given the political cycles and the election cycles that we have. And so that's on the one hand. We've done a lot of writing about this. I'd invite anyone to look at my LinkedIn if you want to learn more about what's really happening. What is it that we should focus on? What are the misunderstandings in the space? Most importantly, I curate a large group of asset owners in a private setting. There's $50 trillion roughly managed by pension funds and university endowments and foundations, largely sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. They're all chasing risk return expectations, annual return targets. They don't have money sitting around just waiting to be invested in the transition. So I think on the one hand, we need to envision specific transitions, region by region, sub-region by sub-region, and really get clear about what it is that we need to do differently. And then I think we need to recognize that the money is just not there. And it's just not sitting around. There aren't trillions and trillions of dollars sitting there waiting to fill this gap. And as a result, I think that's another reason that global cooperation is so essential, because I really think we need to recognize that and work on that together. We learned during the pandemic that we can print money without just destroying the economy. And I'm pretty convinced that we're going to need to do something very creative to fill the finance gap that you're asking about.
Thank you so much, Cary. And I would like to you gave us this kind of like, how can the US support that transition perspective? And I'd like to get back to Philip now. If you could share with us your perspective on what is China doing as well, like projecting itself outwards and overseas, and how is the Belt and Road Initiative contributing or hindering this global transition that we're talking about here? Like, how are, in your view, China's energy policies and investments impacting the renewable energy transition in other regions?
Thank you, Alice. I mean, of course, China's been investing and engaging in energy overseas for more than 30 years. So Xi Jinping's announcement of the Belt and Road in 2013 for us energy wonks was, tell me what's new. I mean, there is something new. There's a gradual shift away from extractive industries in the energy sector towards electricity. And most significant of many announcements on the environment and Belt and Road came in 2021, when Xi Jinping said that there would be no more new coal-fired power projects abroad. And that seems to have happened, though those that were still being contracted and built were being built, the work continued, but no more new projects, as I understand. But total overseas energy engagement declined from $35 billion a year in 2013 to $23 billion a year. So this removal of coal, among other things, has actually reduced overseas investment in energy in total. However, renewable energy, meaning solar and wind, excluding hydro, has increased from $1 billion about in 2013 to $5 or $6 billion a year in the last 2 or 3 years. So there has been a growth of solar and wind investment along the Belt and Road. But that number, if you believe the IEA's estimates of total investment in 2022, the Chinese overseas investment in solar and wind was only 1% of total global investment in solar and wind. Now, don't take the numbers too seriously, but it is small. And so you say, why? And there are two sets of constraints here. And I was in Southeast Asia for 10 years, and I'd go to endless meetings where people say, we've got the money, and other people say, we've got the technology. And basically, the answer was the projects in Southeast Asia, as an example, were non-bankable, or as somebody said to me, the regime is not bankable. The policies and regulations are unstable or unfavorable. You've got land access and permitting problems, local governments, state grid requirements, local content requirements, as well as the fact that the Chinese in some countries are just unpopular. Now, that's so far so good, but that's not everything. A colleague and friend of mine in China, Zhang Sufeng, is carrying out research at the moment, interviewing SOE managers and others. And it also seems that there are constraints back in China, so that in the last few years, you've had tighter controls on overseas investment of all types, which is quite reasonable, risk control. And SASAC is keeping an eye on the state-owned industries. Sinosure, the China Export and Credit Insurance Company, is not providing backing if the project doesn't look good. Chinese policy and commercial banks don't seem to like project financing of renewable energy projects. And within the SOEs themselves, the bureaucratic process to approve is also slow, which means that they miss out on the bidding opportunities. So this is what I'm hearing from my colleague Zhang Sufeng. There's the issues overseas that all renewable energy investors are facing in middle and lower income countries, but there are also, this is also exacerbated by constraints at home. So that's the picture as I see it. China's contribution to solar and wind in middle and low income countries remains low for a variety of reasons. And we haven't seen it growing yet, but I'd be happy if somebody else can correct my rather pessimistic outview at the moment.
Thank you so much, Philip. And it's great to get this understanding of what Cary was saying, like, hey, we actually need way more money. We're falling short of the trillions that are needed, but also to get your perspective on, by the way, even when the money is here, we have this kind of regulatory and political hindrances to actual investment in renewable energy. I would like to open the floor for questions in the room. If our colleagues from media services and the student organizers of this conference present in the room could pass along the microphone, and otherwise I have more questions for my guests, and they're more than welcome to intervene if they wish to and comment on what others have been saying. But before we do that, I just want to make sure that we give a chance to the people participating in this conference today to intervene if they wish to.
I just want to add a comment to Philip's intervention. So I think another consideration too, and Kelly Sims Gallagher, who's based at Tufts, wrote a piece on this where she actually interviewed different stakeholders in Southeast Asia, because of course, a lot of the growth in coal and a lot of the overseas exports of these fossil fired exports from China have been happening in Southeast Asia, which is rapidly urbanizing and industrializing. And what they found is actually a lot of the governments themselves did not want clean energy projects because of the perceived cost and the lack of cost competitiveness with fossil fuels. And so that was also, I think, a different perspective as well. And so their argument was that, yeah, even in these contexts where you would think there would be a lot of openness and opportunity for clean energy investments, the governments themselves were reticent. There were not the governance and the regulatory demand for clean energy. And so that also posed an additional barrier. So just to add, yeah, I think Philip's also really, correct points.
Oh yeah. So like we have the first question like in our room.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I would like to ask, without the option of winning China, especially the Northeast region of coal energy right now, as a traditional energy companies, how can we make coal heating relatively friendly to the environment? And if there's nothing that we can do but to abandon the coal energy as one of its destiny, then I would like to ask, what could be an alternative energy source for this?
So as I understood the question, like how can we transform traditional energy producers, and otherwise, what are the other options? Would any of our guests want to answer that question? Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, basically.
But was it all energy or heating? I heard the word heating. Was it a focus on heating or all energy?
So basically, my parents use coal energy to provide city heating. So that's the system they do. So it's more of a relative question to the family, right?
Okay, I've actually done some work on that last year. It's published with the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. Yes, I mean, for the last 5 years, China's had a clean heating program, changing people to renewable energy, electricity, gas, etc. But one of the problems they've met is money again. You know, quite a lot of money's come down from the central government, but that's not enough. The local governments run out of money also, and a lot of the poor rural people don't have enough money. And even if there's a subsidy for the installation, they still would rather just use coal briquettes or dung or crops because it's cheaper. So there's a huge effort gone on the last 5 years, but it hasn't been as successful as had been hoped, basically because of money. Other problems, but money has been the main thing. But maybe other people have had more on the ground experience. Kevin.
Oh, yes, Philip, I fully agree with you. Clean heating, especially in northern China, is not an easy job. There is no silver bullet to resolve all the problems. So that's why we need a package of tools instead of a single technological solution. We're talking about electrification, biomass heating, heat pump, building installation. But above all, I think both the central and the local government in China need to focus on the local circumstance, and the local development stage is quite important. For instance, in certain rural area, if the parents are relatively poor, the government needs to think about whether those local residents could be absorbed by China's ongoing urbanization trend, or the central government provides tons of one-time subsidies to switch the heating source from coal to natural gas or other alternatives. So what China needs is a sustainable solution which should be tailor-made to local circumstance. There is simply no silver bullet that could be applied across the board. It's an extremely complicated issue.
If I could just suggest one very quick thought, which is that the northeast of China, as I'm sure most know, gets pretty cold, unlike the rest of China. And actually, some parts of the world that get quite cold have been some of the more aggressively successful at sustainability transitions. I'm thinking of countries like Finland, for example, where we spent some time, or even Canada has done some thoughtful work on envisioning what a successful transition might look like. So there might be an opportunity also to learn a bit from the parts of the world that are similar just from a annual temperature standpoint as well.
I would add one more cent because we are talking about northeastern China. So then the problem actually is far beyond the energy arena, because if we look at all the economic troubles in that certain regions in China, it not only need clean energy transition, but also need some economic reform, as well as some institutional reform, even the change of mentality among key decision makers, not only at local government, but also central government level. So that's another reason why energy transition related issue could always be rather complicated, because the solution often lies beyond the energy sector.
Thank you so much to all. Is there any other questions from the room?
Yeah, like we have the same question.
Hi, thank you guys so much for the insights. I just have 2 questions. So the first question is that I heard Philip mentioning that China accounts for a very small percentage of overall overseas investment in green energy. So I'm just curious as to who exactly accounts for the other 99% of the investments, because I would imagine that the US and EU will face similar barriers regarding the local content restrictions. And my second question is that when we study China, I think one of the central themes that we see is that you often observe a tension between the central government and the local government. Like the central government will have some directives regarding the economy or the energy, for example, but certain local governments might not follow that guideline that strictly in order to achieve their own interests. For example, their interest in meeting their developmental quotas. So I was just wondering if that tension also exists in the energy transition space, or whether you think about it differently.
I'll hit the first one. Maybe I didn't express myself properly. I shall put it more simply. Total, according to the IEA, total investment globally in solar and wind was, whatever I said the number was, 500 billion in 2022, plus or minus, obviously. Of that total, 1% was China's overseas investment along the Belt and Road in solar and wind. So what one is saying is most of the investment in solar and wind was probably in China, Japan, maybe Korea, EU, and North America. Okay, so it wasn't saying that North America and Europe were doing lots of investment in low and middle income countries. No one is succeeding in doing vast investment of solar and wind in low and middle income countries in general. There are bound to be exceptions. I hope I've made myself clear there.
So just to clarify, the IEA is the International Energy Agency, just to answer that aspect of the question. But thanks for clarifying, Philip. Anyone wants to tackle the second part of the question on central versus local government?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. That's a really great question. And, as the Chinese Chinyu goes, 山高皇帝远, right? So when the mountains are high, the emperor is far away. And so exactly when you have these very ambitious climate and energy goals that are set at the central government level, and then they have to get passed down to the provinces, to the municipalities, to the towns and the village. And so then there's a lot that can be lost in translation. And I think certainly, as we've seen in the evolution of China's energy and environmental policy, that they've had to tackle this gap. And I think this started to happen in the 11th five-year plan, where China for the first time introduced binding targets for energy and environmental concerns like water pollution and energy intensity and sulfur dioxide emissions. And that's really where you started to see a shift. So less of an emphasis on the GDP, the growth targets, making those soft or aspirational, and instead making the environmental targets hard or binding. And that continued with the 12th five-year plan. And then now we're in the 14th five-year plan. And it's still that balance. But I mean, that being said, I mean, this is exactly why Philip was talking in his introductory remarks about this contradiction, where you still have coal-fired power plants that are being built every single day in China, despite the fact that China has to phase out coal from the electricity sector if they have any hope of achieving the carbon neutrality goal. And it's going to be incredibly difficult. And it's because at the local levels, of course, coal is cheap, and there's a lot of incentive for local industries who still want that cheap coal-fired power base in order to keep their costs low. And so I think this is part of the challenge, and why in the work report you're seeing at the same time the need for market reform and the need for more governance. And certainly in the power sector shortages that afflicted China in 2021, it was exactly because of this tension, where you still had the governments and the regulators having tight control over the coal prices, and not being liberalized and reformed enough. And so there wasn't enough incentive for a lot of these electric power companies to provide power very cheaply, because they were frankly losing money off of it. And then that forced the government to then be in this reactive cycle of then opening up the coal mines that they had long shut down. So what I argued in this New York Times op-ed is that it takes time for this giant ship to turn. So even though the head of the ship, which is the central government, is saying we need to decarbonize, climate change is an important issue. It's a matter of life and death, frankly, in China, in terms of avoided air pollution deaths and heat waves and other types of real impacts. But that it's a large ship, so it's going to take time. And part of the taking time is so that they can work out and try to better align incentives at the local level, so that they are lock in step with what the central government has at least pledged. So I argue, yes, this same type of issue with the mountains being high and the emperor being far away still is applicable to the energy and environmental and climate change context, and it will certainly take time.
So maybe I would also like to add a few sentences in this regard. I agree with Angel. The different interests between central and local government in historical and chronic sticky issues in China. However, when I look at what's going on in China nowadays, there's a easy solution that may be able to bring some incremental improvement to address this particular challenge. If we look at local governor at provincial level, they are always appointed by the central government. Now there's some big problem because the local government will only stay for a couple of years. So they do not have a longer term interest. They prefer to work on some short-term projects that could deliver GDP outcome when they are at the province. So if the central government in China could think very carefully about how the system of appointing and rewarding local governor could be better formulated, this could be beneficial for China to resolve the tension between the central and local government.
What this is telling us is that short-termism is a disease that covers political leaders, whatever the political system.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thought to the questions that have been asked, which has to do with, how do we facilitate more cooperation? One of the things we've seen in China is an attempt to figure out how to take advantage of the latest innovations in green hydrogen and create ammonia out of the renewable energy being generated in the north of China and bring it to other parts of the country. That might be another answer to the Northeast challenge, perhaps. But more generally, we had a small hand in helping start a very successful free newsletter called Climate Tech BC by introducing the two amazing young women who run that with over 50,000 subscribers. The capacity for innovation and the sharing of innovation is also really important here. There's a lot of venture capital and climate-oriented innovation happening in the US. Because of the Inflation Reduction Act, those companies are incented to operate in the US. And so as we saw with COVID, we weren't sharing vaccine technology, which was very unfortunate. Have we not learned that we should be sharing innovations that are created not only in the US, but in China? I think it's a great opportunity for China to innovate and to actually deploy infrastructure around the world that has a more green aspect. So, for all of the getting together that we do year after year for COP, I'd love to see us get together and really figure out how we could work together in a positive way and figure out where the money will come from and how can we innovate together and stop being so nationalistic about it. The EU and the UK are now having to respond, and Canada, to the Inflation Reduction Act, and in many ways it's not helpful.
Thank you so much, Cary, for those inspiring remarks and a suggestion of how to better enhance cooperation on this essential topic. I'm worried about the time being almost over, so I just want to check whether we have one or two final questions from the room that we could take together, and otherwise I will drive to our concluding remarks and ending this panel.
So do we have any more questions in the room?
Hi, thank you so much for the discussion. I'm just wondering, because I've been hearing about central government a lot. So I'm just wondering, which department or agency in the central government is actually in charge of financially support the sustainable development and transition? How do they get money? How do they spend their money? And where does that money go to? Thank you very much.
Any of our guests wants to take that question on how is the Chinese central government organized around energy issues and specifically energy transition?
Well, the question was finance. Yeah. And I mean, obviously the Ministry of Finance has the money. And I looked it up, and they will follow policy from the State Council or the National Development Reform Commission with its National Energy Agency. And I think it was a very good example of how this works well and then not well a few years ago. Somebody, maybe Kevin, can remind us of the details. And basically, there was a fund set up to support renewable energy deployment. And that was collected from electricity tariffs, put in a fund, and then pushed out to the companies installing renewable energy. But the problem was that the fund wasn't big enough. And so a lot of people installed their renewable energy and found that they didn't actually get the subsidy from the Ministry of Finance. So there's a mechanism there, but as everywhere, governments never have as much money as they would like. And maybe either Kevin or Angel or Cary can pick up and generalize on that one.
So the system is pretty fragmented. So when we look at the project permitting, National Development and Reform Commission often plays a role. If the money is about technological innovation, in the past, Ministry of Science and Technology plays a very important role, how the funding will be allocated. But if the funding is related to university, Ministry of Education often it often evolved. So that's why the system is rather complicated in the past. Whenever we look at how the situation could be further optimized, there's always some suggestion China should establish a Ministry of Energy. However, if we look at an example in different parts of the world, China shouldn't trying to tackle one specific important issue by establishing a greenfield agency. That's not how the system should be reformed. I personally believe China should look at how the inter-department coordination could be optimized, could be improved down the road instead of continuously creating a more small working group or a more commission. So that's my personal opinion.
Sorry,
Angel,
I'll
were
just,
you trying?
yes,
Yeah.
I was trying to unmute when my phone was not working. I agree completely with what Philip and Kevin said. It's incredibly fragmented in terms of the financing structures and the institutions in China. And I think this is one of the reasons why China has really been trying to kickstart private sources of green finance for clean energy technology. And I wrote a piece a couple years ago looking at and making some of these arguments. Like in the United States, we've been really successful in developing green banks, for example. I lived in the state of Connecticut for more than 10 years, and it was one of the US's first examples of a green bank system where they could actually give favorable loans to residential homeowners to increase and install solar photovoltaic on their rooftop. And it was incredibly successful at increasing the amount of solar PV being installed throughout the state of Connecticut. And so China has established a green finance committee to try to look into some of these institutions and mechanisms, but it's been really hard. And part of that relates back to a core area of my research and work, which is data, and the fact that for a lot of these projects, it's unclear in terms of, and Cary knows a lot more about this than I do, but just all the transparency and details on return on investment. There's not really the same type of transparency and reporting culture as Cary said on ESG. It's still quite nascent in China. And so that's, I think, really stymied a lot of the efforts to get more private finance. And of course, with the strict regulatory environment of China, that's also been really difficult. But absolutely, as Philip emphasized, public finance is not nearly enough. And so what normally happens after the funding is allocated from the national level, they expect the states or the provinces and then also the municipalities to then match a certain amount of the national subsidy. And that's been proven to be very difficult, and then also in encouraging and attracting private finance. So it's incredibly fragmented. They need to increase the amount of private sector green energy finance, but that's been really difficult because of the data transparency reporting issues and the lack of experience in terms of a lot of these mechanisms. But in this piece, we talk about, the idea of green banks, and as Kevin mentioned, some of these super fund types of programs to help with at least environmental remediation projects and whatnot. So I'm happy to share some. I know I mentioned a lot of pieces of writing, but I'm happy to share those with organizers for folks afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. If there's no last question from the room, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to our esteemed guests speaking with us today. What I will take away from this discussion is the stakes are extremely high and the challenges are numerous on the road. But as I understand it, from at least what I will take from that discussion is that there are so many ways that we can approach this at various levels, either central government or local government or non-state actors, specifically businesses and finance investors, as to how to enhance the efforts for this accelerated energy transition that we so need. One word that stuck with me is the word trust, and how we should obviously count on the efforts of those two massive emitters that are the US and China, but we should also not expect them to take the brunt of everything, and we should all try as much as we can to work on building that trust and building that collective effort of doing more to enhance that energy transition. So this being said, thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us in the room. Thank you so much for the organizers for this very important conversation today, and congratulations for participating in this global forum today with us. Thank you so much.